Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. And so the story of Joshua ends. The closing verses of chapter 24 chronicles the death of Joshua, but it's far from the end of the people of Israel. Their leader was gone, but they had just begun their possession of the land. There was much work to be done. The Canaanites had not yet been eliminated, but God was still prepared to help them finish what they had begun. The real question would be whether they would remain faithful to God and trust Him as they continued to possess the land. But with Joshua's death, a change began to take place within the people of Israel. Their leader was gone. The motivation and direction he had provided for years was no longer available. And as the rest of Joshua's generation died off, a new generation rose up that didn't know the Lord. They had not been trained in the ways of God. They had not been told the stories of God's miraculous interventions. And as the book of Judges reveals, the people of God failed to follow God faithfully, and they suffered the consequences. Joshua lived to the ripe old age of 110. He had served Israel for many years and had led them into the Promised Land, but also in their efforts to conquer and possess it. Under his guidance, the Israelites had gone from a ragtag assemblage of former slaves to a powerful force in the Middle East. They had successfully and in most cases miraculously defeated the inhabitants of the land of Canaan, taking over their cities, villages, pastures, and fields. By the end of his tenure as Israel's spiritual and military leader, the Israelites were well established in the land promised to them by God many centuries earlier. But as they say, all good things must come to an end. And Joshua's lifespan reached its allotted course. He died, leaving the people of Israel without an appointed leader. Joshua had not followed the example of Moses, who had passed on the mantle of leadership to him before his own death. Perhaps Joshua assumed that each of the 12 tribes, now established in the land with their own inheritance to manage, would appoint their own leadership. After their renewal of the covenant at Shechem, each of the tribes had dispersed to their own cities and villages, and they were to have begun the final stage of God's command to eliminate the Canaanites from the land. There were no longer going to be any joint military efforts involving the forces of all 12 tribes. Instead, each tribe would be expected to possess and police its land allotment on its own. And one of the things that will become increasingly clear as their story unfolds is that without proper leadership, the people of Israel tended to lack follow-through. In the opening verses of the book of Judges, which chronicles the next chapter in the story of the Israelites' conquest of the land of Canaan, it becomes clear that the tribes are attempting to follow the example left for them by Joshua. They seek the counsel of God in order to determine their next steps. After the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, "Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites, to fight against them?" The Lord said, "Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand." And Judah said to Simeon his brother, "Come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites. And I likewise will go with you into the territory allotted to you." So Simeon went with him. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. Judges 1, verses 1 through 4. They begin to form some strategic alliances among themselves in order to improve their chances of success against the Canaanites. And God gave the tribes of Judah and Simeon success in their efforts. But there's a nagging pattern of incompleteness that permeates the opening chapters of Judges. They enjoyed success, but it seems that it was always marked by a failure to finish what they had started. And the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain, because they had chariots of iron. Judges 1, verse 19. Notice what this verse says. The Lord was with Judah, but God was fighting alongside the people of Judah and Simeon, and they had enjoyed numerous victories as a result. But the presence of chariots of iron had stopped their progress. They had come up against a superior force that had somehow stymied their efforts. But years earlier, long before the Israelites had made it into the land of Canaan, God had told them, "When you go out to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army larger than your own, you shall not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." Deuteronomy 20, verse 1. Their inability to stand against an enemy with chariots and horses was due to a lack of faith on their part, not a deficiency in God's power to deliver. And their failure to trust God would become a pattern that would repeat itself in the story of each of the tribes. But the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Judges 1, verse 21. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, for the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in that land. Judges 1, verse 27. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, so the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Judges 1, verse 28. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, or the inhabitants of Nahalal, so the Canaanites lived among them. Judges 1, verse 29. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Acco, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Alab, or of Akzib, or of Helbah, or of Aphik, or of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Judges 1, verses 31 through 32. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth-Anah. So they lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Judges 1, verse 33. The Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. Judges 1, verse 34. These are not just statements of military failure or incomplete conquest. They're a reflection of the state of Israel's spiritual health. They were failing because they were no longer trusting God. They were making compromises and concessions. Allowing their enemies to remain in the land was easier than stepping out in faith and eliminating them completely as God had commanded them to do. And God reprimanded them for their lack of faith, accusing them of not only disobedience, but of failing to keep the covenant they had made with him. Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. Judges 2, verses 1 through 3. Their disobedience to God was going to be costly. They were going to learn just how difficult spiritual warfare was going to be without God's help. And the book of Judges provides us with an important detail concerning the leadership of Joshua and its impact on the people of Israel. The people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. Judges 2, verse 7. But this is followed by a sobering caveat, an all-telling addendum that will set the stage for all that comes later in the book of Judges. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, or the work that he had done for Israel. Judges 2, verse 10. The final chapter of the book of Joshua chronicles the deaths of Joshua and Eleazar. It also provides details concerning the interment of Joseph's bones, brought back from Egypt. But it really paints a bleak picture concerning the death of an entire generation. Those who had come from Egypt under the leadership of Moses had died in the wilderness because of their failure to enter the land the first time. And all those who had played a role in conquering the land under Joshua's leadership would eventually die as well. Their days in the land would be numbered, just as Joshua's had been. And as long as he was alive, they had served the Lord. But with his death, they began to falter and fail in their commitments to God and their capacity to trust his word. And by the time they pass off the scene, the next generation had long forgotten who God was or any of the great things he had done. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. Judges 2, verses 11 through 13. It happened just as God said it would. They had failed to do what God had commanded, and as a result, their hearts were led away from him. The failure of a single generation to maintain their covenant faithfulness to God resulted in an entire spiritual meltdown on the part of their descendants. The book of Psalms provides a stark reminder of just how different things should have turned out had the people of Israel done what they had been told to do. What we have heard and learned, that which our ancestors have told us, we will not hide from their descendants. We will tell the next generation about the Lord's praiseworthy acts, about his strength and the amazing things he has done. Psalm 78, verses 3 through 4. so that the next generation, children yet to be born, might know about them. They will grow up and tell their descendants about them. Then they will place their confidence in God. They will not forget the works of God, and they will obey His commands. Then they will not be like their ancestors, who were a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that was not committed and faithful to God. Psalm 78, verses 6 through 8. But sadly there arose another generation after them, who did not know the Lord or the work that He had done for Israel.